Good morning, everyone. As we begin, I want to note that we are holding this hearing in compliance with the regulations for committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 8. And so I will ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any point, and that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and have any written statements be made a part of the record. I hear no objections, and so it is therefore ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that my dear friend, Congressman Al Lawson of the 5th District of Florida, be allowed to join us. Congresswoman Kat Cammack of the 3rd District of, did I say Georgia? Florida, yes. Okay, the 5th District of Florida, and Congresswoman Kat Cammack of the 3rd District of Florida, and Carlos Jimenez of the 26th District of Florida. I ask unanimous consent that all 3 be allowed to join this panel today. I hear no objection. Thank you to our colleague, Mr. Lawson, for so warmly welcoming us here to Tallahassee, and to our colleagues who are joining us for today's proceedings, both here in Florida and virtually. Thank you also to the Tallahassee City Hall for hosting us, and to our witnesses for joining us for this important hearing. We are here today to continue this subcommittee's examination of voting in America and to discuss the state of voting and access to the ballot here in the state of Florida. The 2020 election was fair and secure, so says security experts at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, election experts, and Florida's own state officials. All of them have said the same thing. The 2020 election was fair and secure. However, despite no evidence whatsoever supporting the need for new election restrictions, in 2021, Florida enacted a sweeping piece of elections legislation that erects many, many new and unnecessary barriers to the ballot. More than 4 million Floridians cast a mail-in ballot in the last election, with no evidence of any widespread security risk or election fraud. Yet Florida enacted new restrictions, making it more difficult to cast a mail-in ballot, such as limiting access ballot drop boxes, making it more difficult to remain on the state's vote-by-mail list, and limiting the ability to provide and receive assistance for returning a ballot. These are just a few examples of the barriers enacted by Senate Bill 90. This law is the subject of ongoing litigation, with a federal judge recently ruling that several of the law's provisions are unconstitutional. Furthermore, Florida has taken the troubling step of creating a new Office of Election Crimes and Security. And I've done a lot of research on that in the last 48 hours, and that appears to be very disappointing, and I hope to hear some reasons today why it should or should not continue. But they've created an Office of Election Crimes and Security to investigate supposed election fraud and crimes, despite no evidence of either in Florida's elections. Enacting laws such as this does not bolster election integrity. Rather, it creates a serious risk for voter and election administrator intimidation, and it perpetuates the false narrative that American elections are not secure. In the wake of an election with record voter participation and in which more than 11 million Floridians cast a ballot, we should be working to increase ballot access, not erecting unnecessary barriers that could very well disenfranchise voters. These are just 2 examples of recent actions taken in the state. Florida's new congressional map is also the subject of ongoing litigation for arguably diluting minority voting strength. And despite the overwhelming will of Florida voters in 2018 to re-enfranchise formerly incarcerated individuals, Florida enacted legislation requiring all returning citizens to pay all the fines and fees they may owe before their right to vote is restored, erecting a terrible financial barrier to voting that many may not be able to overcome. The ability to cast a ballot free of undue burden and discrimination is the cornerstone of our participatory democracy. It should not be determined by geography, but it should be free, fair, and equitable for every American. Securing our elections should be a top priority, but it should not be used as a pretense to enact laws making it harder for voters to access the ballot. And so with all of that said, I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about the state of voting and access to the ballot here in Florida, and continuing to work with my colleagues to ensure that we break down barriers so every voter can cast their ballot. Thank you for listening. I'm now going to recognize my friend who I see on the screen and hope he is well. I now recognize Ranking Member Style for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I wish I could be with you in person. I think it's actually terrific we're in Florida. The only state I could think it would be better to be in today would be Georgia, where we can celebrate record voter turnout despite all the claims made on the left of attempts to limit voter access. What we actually saw yesterday in Georgia was record voter turnout, both on the Democrat and on the Republican side, despite there even being a competitive Democratic primary. I'd say that's success. What we're actually seeing is laws being put in place that make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And so I think it's important now that we've seen the success in Georgia. It's important that we're having this hearing about access to the ballot in Florida, because I think Florida has worked hard to strengthen their laws to ensure free, fair, and secure elections. So is Wisconsin, as I mentioned, Georgia. Voters are noticing, and there's increased turnout at the polls, which is good for our democracy. You see, we don't need top-down federal mandates. States who have primary authority over elections are in the best position to understand their voter needs and how to address them. Florida actually is a perfect example of this. Since the infamous 2000 election with the hanging chads, they identified problems in the process and fixed them in ways that worked for Florida voters. And once that trust was restored, voter turnout increased. In 2002, voter turnout was 55%, according to Florida's Division of Elections. In 2020, voter turnout was 77%, the highest in 20 years. And just for comparison, because it's hard to do apples to apples, Delaware, home state of our president, had a lower voter turnout rate of just over 68%. This effect is not contained to just Florida. My home state in Wisconsin has implemented photo ID and had one of the highest election turnout rates in the country in 2020. Georgia is seeing an impressive increase in voter turnout after updating their election laws. The proof is in the pudding from the results yesterday. I want to read from a Washington Post article published prior to the election this weekend, in particular as it relates to voter turnout. They said, quote, after 3 weeks of early voting ahead of Tuesday's primary, yesterday's primary, record-breaking turnout is undercutting predictions that Georgia Election Integrity Act of 2021 would lead to a fall off in voting. By the end of Friday, last Friday, the final day of early in-person voting, nearly 800,000 Georgians had cast ballots, more than 3 times the number in 2018 and higher than even in the 2020 presidential year. The fact is federalism works. We don't need to nationalize our elections and unconstitutionally take power away from states as those who support H.R. 1 propose. Laws like H.R. 1 would have actually made it harder for Florida and Georgia to implement the necessary safeguards that have ultimately restored voter confidence while also increasing participation. Laws like H.R. 1 would instead have the opposite impact, undermining voter confidence because it would gut common sense voter integrity provisions like voter ID. We hear disinformation from those on the left and the Biden administration constantly that states with new election integrity laws are suppressing voters, that common sense voter integrity provisions like voter ID will make it harder to vote. President Biden even received 4 Pinocchios for his claims about the Georgia election law. With all these clearly factually inaccurate statements coming from the Biden administration and those on the left, it's too bad maybe that we don't have Biden's disinformation czar to help us with the fact checks, because the proof is in the pudding from yesterday when we saw massive and record-breaking voter participation in Georgia following their laws to improve voter integrity in Georgia. Instead of attacking key voter integrity provisions and undermining trust, we should be working together to restore faith in our elections. Those on the left continue to make unsubstantiated claims. The Republican-led states like Florida are trying to suppress voters. They are chipping away at America's confidence in our republic. And I suggest to my colleagues who are currently down in the great state of Florida that they take some time to actually learn what the state is doing and take some notes to share with their colleagues from other states, because to me it's clear that what the Sunshine State is doing is not suppressing voter turnout. What we saw play out in Georgia did not suppress voter turnout. And in fact, some of the states that we hear the biggest complaints about are actually able to generate the highest voter participation because people are beginning to gain trust in their elections. It's those on the left who are undermining our democracy by making false claims. I look forward to today's hearing, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and thank you to the ranking member for your 5-minute statement. At this time, I will now recognize the ranking member of our full committee, Congressman Rodney Davis of Illinois, for any remarks that he would like to make. Rodney?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's great to see you. I wish I could be there with you today, and also with my good friend, Mr. Anderson. Thank you for joining us today as a witness, and I also see my friend and colleague, Mr. Jimenez. I really appreciate your participation. I'd like to start by noting that we should be having today's subcommittee hearing in President Biden's home state of Delaware, or maybe Speaker Nancy Pelosi's home state of California, or even Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's home state of New York. Those states have a lot to learn from Republican-led states like Florida, who have done the hard work of identifying issues and updating their election laws to restore integrity and voter confidence. I'd also like to quickly echo the ranking member, Mr. Stile, in applauding Florida for identifying lessons learned following the 2000 election and devising solutions that work for Floridians, ultimately becoming the gold standard, an accomplishment they've achieved without a federal takeover of their elections. To be fair, like any other state, Florida's had some bad actors. Voters in South Florida have witnessed firsthand a total display of incompetence over the years in heavily Democratic Broward County by former Supervisor of Elections Brenda Snipes. Specifically, I'd like to reference Ms. Snipes' own acknowledgement that ineligible non-voters have voted in previous elections and that she couldn't find as many as 2,040 ballots during the 2018 midterm recount. Not to mention her failure to report vote counts in accordance with Florida law. Thankfully for Broward County voters, she had no choice but to resign in 2018. But again, Florida exercised its sovereign power to address these issues, including through Florida's newly signed election law, Senate Bill 90, all without federal interference. Here's what Florida's new law does right. It requires biannual maintenance of Florida's online voter registration system, strengthens security around drop boxes, increases transparency from county voting websites on Election Day, enhances transparency regarding voter registration and ballot duplication, and tightens provisions on ballot harvesting, just to list a few of the provisions. These common sense measures should be nonpartisan, but Democrats continue to peddle the verifiably false narrative that Republicans are trying to suppress eligible voters, when instead, Republicans want all eligible voters who want to vote to be able to cast a ballot, and for those ballots to be counted according to law. And Republicans want election processes to be transparent, consistent, and easy to understand. Yet Democrats are using this fable of voter suppression to push a federal power grab that is politically advantageous for those on the left. And Florida's election law has survived review by the courts. An Obama-appointed district judge had struck down the new law, but that decision was swiftly and rightfully overturned by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. The Florida legislature and Governor Ron DeSantis have been leading on election integrity issues and have set an example for other states on how they can take a more proactive approach to ensuring voters can have confidence in election processes and outcomes from start to finish. Last month, Governor DeSantis also signed Senate Bill 524 into law, legislation that requires voter rolls to be annually reviewed and updated, strengthens ID requirements, and prevents election supervisors from taking Zucker bucks. Perhaps most notably, the bill establishes the Office of Election Crimes and Security to investigate voter fraud and increase penalties for ballot harvesting. We should all want free, fair, and transparent elections. So this bill should be welcomed even those on the left. But again, it really doesn't fit their narrative. Nevertheless, it's not too late to change course. I urge my Democrat colleagues to stop spreading misinformation about Florida's election laws and instead help encourage every state to implement similar safeguards that restore faith in our elections. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his opening statement. At this time, it is my pleasure to recognize your congressman here in Tallahassee and surrounding counties, Congressman Al Lawson of Florida's 5th Congressional District, for any comments that he would like to make. Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to Tallahassee, the capital of Florida. And it's a pleasure to have you and the members to join us. And I would like to tell you that Tallahassee is built on several hills, and we border Georgia. Remember this morning you asked me how close with Georgia, and I told you it's about 28 miles from here. And so we have a lot in common. We wanted you all to enjoy the scenery in Tallahassee. I know that you are on a short notice, but we are bordered here by two universities, Florida A&M University, Florida State University, and a community college. And right from where we are here in City Hall, we are less than a mile for each one of the universities. They're very close to each other. So we have a lot of students here. And right behind us is the Capitol, and as you know, they are in session, at this time to do something about the insurance problems, property insurance that we have in the state of Florida. We certainly hope that staff is here. My staff is here that came down from D.C., and we are honored to have the election committee come to Florida to discuss those issues that we have involved in the process that we have in the state of Florida. Also, I'd like to welcome the panel here. I think we have an outstanding panel for discussion that we have today, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to visit with them. And so we want to make you an honorary member of the state of Florida, Mr. Chairman. And so we don't want this to be your last trip. Some of the other members to the Tallahassee area. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawson. I have family in Daytona Beach, and years ago, family in Ocala, Florida, so I do have some roots. In Opelika, Florida. That's right. All right, let's move right along. Before I introduce our witnesses, as a reminder, each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes. Your entire written statements will be made part of the record. The record will remain open for at least 5 days for additional materials to be submitted. And so again, welcome to our witnesses. Joining us today, first is Brad Ashwell of All Voting is Local, Gadsden County Commissioner Brenda Holt, Cecily Schoon of the League of Women Voters of Florida, Matletha Bennett of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and finally, Seminole County Supervisor of Elections, Chris Anderson. Thank all of you. Also, let me say that Brad is the Florida State Director of All Voting is Local. Mr. Ashwell has more than 15 years of state and federal legislative experience with nonprofit advocacy groups working to improve election administration system and voter access. The Honorable Brenda Holt serves as commissioner on the Gadsden County, Florida Commission and has served on that commission since 2002. She was the first African-American woman elected to the commission. She has served 5 times as commission chair and is past president of the local chapter of the NAACP. Ms. Schoon is the president of the League of Women Voters of Florida, the first African-American to serve in this capacity. She's a civil rights lawyer in Panama City, past president of the League of Women Voters of Bay County, served 5 years as an active duty Air Force JAG officer. Impressive. Matletha Bennett serves as senior staff attorney of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Voting Rights Program. Prior to joining the Southern Poverty Law Center, she served as legal and legislative advisor to the Florida Senate Democratic Office, providing analysis and input on election law, as well as criminal and civil justice policies. Chris Anderson, should I introduce Chris Anderson? He's with us virtually. He's on Zoom. Sorry about that, Chris. Chris Anderson is the supervisor of elections in Seminole County. He was appointed supervisor of elections by Governor DeSantis beginning in January of 2019. Prior to this, Mr. Anderson served in the U.S. military, in law enforcement, and in the county tax collector's office. With that said, I'm now ready to begin with Mr. Ashwell. You are now recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning. My name is Brad Ashwell. I'm the Florida State Director for All Voting is Local, and I'd like to thank Chairman Butterfield, Ranking Member Stile, Congressman Lawson, and members of the subcommittee for giving me the opportunity to testify today. All Voting is Local was launched in 2018 as a campaign of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We work to eliminate needless and discriminatory barriers to voting before they become a problem on Election Day so that democracy works for all of us. My comments today will focus on several of the more dangerous barriers to the ballot currently facing Florida voters due to recent legislative changes that were fueled by lies and conspiracy theories that imperil our freedom to vote and our democracy. Florida has a long history of voter intimidation through the use of law enforcement, dating back to Jim Crow. The centerpiece of SB 524 legislation signed into law exactly a month ago builds on this dark history through the creation of a new elections police unit called the Office of Election Crimes and Security, which wields a dangerous degree of power with few checks. Under this office, non-sworn agents have authority to pursue investigations of potential election law violations and any election irregularities, a broad term bill sponsors refuse to define. Also, the office will be able to self-initiate investigations, something not even the state's Ethics Commission can do. The office will also be able to investigate claims that are filed anonymously. There's nothing to prevent this office from being used to fuel misinformation about the election process based on frivolous and anonymous claims aimed at discouraging participation or intimidating voters. We're also concerned that the office could be used to target voter registration groups and local election officials for partisan purposes to either thwart participation or even upend election results themselves. Vote by mail is secure and popular. It's been a mainstay in Florida for 2 decades, with voters across the ideological spectrum successfully using this method to vote. Unfortunately, vote by mail has become the primary target of anti-voter legislation. Following the 2020 election, state legislators focused on criminalizing efforts to assist voters who need help returning their vote by mail ballots. SB 90 in 2021 made it a misdemeanor for anyone to return vote by mail ballots other than their own, their immediate family members, and 2 additional ballots. This year, SB 524 elevated the penalty for violating this law from a misdemeanor to a 3rd-degree felony. This not only criminalizes Floridians who help others deliver their vote by mail ballots, but also could punish them by taking away their right to vote if found in violation, even if they did not intend to violate the law. SB 90 also imposed a new requirement that voters include additional identification on vote by mail requests, a Florida driver's license, a state ID card number, or last 4 digits of their social security number. The bill also requires supervisors of elections to match that identification submitted by the voter before validating the request. The problem is election officials don't have that identification data on file for all voters, particularly some older voters. Supervisors of elections are not required to contact the voter if they're unable to confirm their ID. Some of those who want to do that outreach have even told us they might not have the time in the busy days leading up to the election. Just to give you some numbers, as of May 2021, over 600,000 registered voters in the Florida voter registration system did not have a driver's license, state ID, or social security number on file. Broward County Supervisor of Election has reported that he had 73,000 vote-by-mail requests with no matchable identifiers on file last fall before the Congressional District 20 special election. He tried to contact those voters, most of whom were seniors, but only received a 10% response rate. Just this week, there was an article in the Pensacola News Journal about the Escambia County Supervisor of Elections notifying 14,000 voters about their registration data. They lacked the registration data on file that was needed to receive a vote-by-mail ballot. These requirements place additional unfunded burdens on supervisors of elections to send mailers, conduct voter education, and other efforts to reduce confusion, ideally the number of rejected vote-by-mail ballots. These issues I've spoken about are merely a sampling of the problems created by this legislation. I wish I had an hour. In conclusion, our democracy works best when every voter can make their voice heard. Election administration practices must be used to ensure that the freedom to vote belongs to all Americans. Instead, recently adopted laws and practices establish barriers to voting and serve to disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of Floridians, particularly voters of color. Floridians deserve free and fair elections, not more restrictions on access to the ballot. We look forward to working with elected officials at all levels of government to ensure that elections are administered fairly and equitably so that every American, regardless of race, socioeconomic status, age, or ability, can make their voices heard. Nothing short of our democracy is at stake. And that concludes my comments. Thank you.
And we thank you, Mr. Ashwell. At this time, I recognize Commissioner Holt.
Thank you very much. Let's see if it's on. Yes, thank you very much. I just sat and listened to everything, and almost my data is almost exactly the same as the gentleman next to me. But I would like to thank the Chairman Butterfield, and I would like to thank the subcommittee chair, Mr. Stiles, for his comments. This opportunity to speak is very important. It's very important in Florida, and I'm from Gaston County, Congressman Lawson's home county. And I would like to say this, instead of requoting some of the things that were already said, we are on the Georgia-Florida line. Before I got on the board in Gaston County, some of my constituents, some of the constituents in that county had to go up into Georgia come back into Florida to vote because they didn't have access to a polling place within 5 to 10 miles of their home. So those are problems that we had. Once laws changed that say that you could vote inside of the supervisor's office if you could not get to your polling place, and you could vote in the supervisor's office. The previous supervisor of elections said, you can't vote here. And he put them out, and I was there. So those are some things that happen when you have people controlling the elections that do not have any intent on doing the right thing. As far as the people that vote in the rural areas, and Gaston County is a rural county, it is less than 50,000 people. They're predominantly black county, the only predominantly black county in the state of Florida. They're not there by accident. They're there because when slaves were brought into Florida, they were distributed out of the Gaston territory throughout the state of Florida. Tennessee Street that goes through Tallahassee from the Gulf, it's US 90, over to the Atlantic. That's the slave trail. That's where they brought the slaves into Gaston. They divided them up. The towns are 25 to 30 miles apart because that's how far a slave male can carry products on his back in a day. So when you see things being changed, that we can't have our own representative in Congressional District 5, it's very important to us. I received several calls that said from people that know the history of Gaston County saying, Brenda, say this, Brenda, say that. Why are we not being treated fairly? So these are the things that are very concerning to people that are poor. Now, when you're talking about, there are congressmen and women talking about ballot harvesting. If you live 10 miles from town and you are going to take the ballots into town, you have your cousins and relatives and other, so you got to go make 2 or 3 trips in order to get those ballots there if you're going to take them in. And so you're not talking about around the corner, down the street to a drop box. You're talking about some distance. And so you can't take cousins' ballots. You can't take any other relatives' ballots other than the ones that are stated in that law. These are the things that are concerning. They cause hardship on people that already do not have money to do that. When we look at the causes of these laws, you have to always say, how do people say Republican and Democrat, right and left? What happened to just doing the right thing to help people? There we have a problem. And I'll tell you another problem. That's why the people in minorities do not trust these new laws. There are several reasons, but if you just look at the history of moving red and black Indians out of our county in this area to Oklahoma, they had a tradition. The path was to take a stick and trim it. And if it's lighter than your skin, you have to go to Oklahoma. And then what happened after that, they would put the stick in your hair and shake your head. If the stick falls out, you have to go to Oklahoma. So we look very suspiciously at these type of laws when they come. What is this election police law going to do? How many people are going to not come in to vote simply because they think you're going to do something to them? These are the true facts that happen. You have my congressional statement. As I said before, we have had the previous supervisor of election and his father were there for a combined session of 52 years, and it was very difficult for blacks in Gaston County to vote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your testimony. And I might say, when I was a young boy in Wilson, North Carolina, there was a local African-American attorney who was blind, who was from Gaston, Florida, Gaston County, Florida, and his name was Gaston.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, so thank you for your testimony.
You.
This time, I recognize Ms. Schoon for her 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you.
Yes.
Commissioner Chair Butterfield and other members, thank you for this opportunity to speak today. My name is Cecily Schoon, and I speak on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Florida. We are a nonpartisan organization encouraging citizens to register to vote and to educate voters so they can vote with knowledge. The League's origin experience as women blocked from voting over 100 years ago has made us concerned about all marginalized voters, and the early suffragettes' initial desire to vote was driven by the realization that women's efforts to abolish slavery would not be taken seriously without their right to vote. Testimony in the recent Senate Bill 90 litigation this year revealed that the legislators would ask the Division of Elections how different groups of people voted, including African Americans, and the legislator would pass new legislation that would have a direct and disproportionate impact on African American voters. This has happened at least 5 times over the last 20 years, beginning with Senate Bill 1355, which cut back early voting, eliminating one of the Sundays that Black churches were using to increase voting with their efforts called Souls to the Polls. The League sued on that case and won, and many of those rules were struck down. In addition, the testimony in Senate Bill 90 litigation showed that African Americans relied very heavily on third-party voter registrant organizations, more so than other groups. So any of the laws that threaten or affect third-party organizations also have, like the League of Women Voters, also have a disparate impact on persons of color. The next law that was looked at in the litigation and the testimony was Senate Bill 7066, which added a requirement that all financial obligations in a sentence had to be paid before a person could register to vote. This impacted Amendment 4, which was passed by the citizens as a citizen initiative to restore voting rights of returning citizens, those with felony convictions, once their sentence was completed. This additional requirement to pay all the financial obligations has impacted 800,000 to 1.4 million persons, and a disproportionate number of those persons are African Americans. In 2021, the legislature passed Senate Bill 90 with limitations on the hours and days of early drop box uses. Given the multiple jobs that many African Americans have and the shift work they do, it is going to be impossible or close to impossible for them to get off during regular business hours to use the drop box and put their ballot in there. In addition, with the limitations on not being able to turn in other people's ballots, which was customarily used in many Black churches to help the disabled and the elderly, that's also going to impact many African Americans. Again, the League went to court with several of our allies, and we won in trial court. This win has been appealed, and there is a stay on the remedy. This issue of limiting voting limitations has continued this year with the passage of Senate Bill 524. One of the things that it does is it increases the penalty on third-party voter registrants, their annual penalty from $1,000 a year to $50,000 a year. This amount of money is going to impact and scare many smaller third-party voter registrant organizations such as small churches, and it will impact the League. It also makes it a felony for someone to collect, even for free, ballots of non-family members, more than 2 per election. And then we come to redistricting. And the saga of redistricting in Florida this year is well known. The governor started from the beginning insisting that he wanted his map drawn. He tried to get an advisory opinion from the Florida Supreme Court. He drafted a map himself, which is unusual, and that map essentially diminishes the voting power of African Americans by limiting their number of districts that they have from 4 to 2. We believe that we have had to rely upon the courts to stop these incursions in the voting rights of others. We contend that the governor's map is an affront to the requirement to follow judicial precedent. It's an affront to the voters of Florida, all of whom voted for fair districts, which provides protections against such voter limitations with redistricting. And we thank you very much for this opportunity to speak.
And we thank you as well. Ms. Bennett, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Butterfield, Ranking Member Stile, Congressman Al Lawson, and members of the Committee on House Administration, Subcommittee on Elections. I am Matletha Bennett, a senior staff attorney in the Voting Rights Practice Group at the Southern Poverty Law Center and SPLC Action Fund. Florida has a long history of denying voting rights to its citizens. Despite gains made over the past several decades, we face a renewed commitment to return to the old shameful days of poll taxes, literacy tests, identification cards, and citizenship tests. These modern-day voter suppression efforts are often rhetorically clothed in election integrity legislation. As a result, opponents of voting reform emboldened by lies of fraud have been successful in inciting violence, intimidating voters, and subverting the will of the people. To help the subcommittee understand the historical context for these efforts, our written testimony describes how Florida used tools such as grandfather clauses and literacy tests to circumvent the constitutionally protected class of race in the 15th Amendment, how Floridians resorted to violence to silence the Black electorate, culminating in the 1920 Ocoee Election Day Massacre, how in 2013, the Supreme Court stripped away Section 5 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and how there is a need for federal action to stop the wave of discriminatory voting laws flooding the South. In 2018, 65% of Floridians voted yes to Amendment 4, restoring rights to up to 1.4 million individuals with criminal records, and promulgating the largest expansion of the right to vote since the Voting Rights Act. In response, Florida officials enacted so-called implementing legislation that gutted the spirit of Amendment 4 by conditioning the right to vote on the ability to pay a fee. This unconstitutional poll tax discriminates against people based on their wealth and continues to disenfranchise hundreds of thousands of Floridians. Some estimates even say about 80% of those who would have originally been re-enfranchised are still disenfranchised. These individuals are struggling to obtain decent jobs or housing and finding it impossible to navigate Florida's decentralized system of records. Over the last few years, suppressive voting measures such as Senate Bill 90 and Senate Bill 524 have created unnecessary barriers and burdens that disproportionately and unconstitutionally impact Black and Latinx voters, women voters, the elderly, and voters with disabilities. Rapidly changing election laws have planted confusion in the minds of voters about new rules and inspired fear in local election officials. As weapons of harassment and intimidation, these excessive restrictions perpetuate distrust and decrease voter turnout. The Office of Election Crimes and Security in Senate Bill 524 is unnecessary and duplicative. Without guardrails, it is an unwieldy tool for targeting voter registration groups and local election officials, a terrifying reminder of this country's history of using law enforcement to threaten and intimidate people from voting. Florida has ramped up arrests of formerly incarcerated citizens now being charged with committing voter fraud, some of whom mistakenly thought they could vote in the wake of confusing guidance following the passage of Amendment 4. Political bodies across the country seek to drown out the minority vote through gerrymandered redistricting maps, igniting a political tug-of-war for local, state, and congressional seats. Our democracy is under threat. These anti-voter reforms are compounded by a thread of lies weaving its way through our country. The internet is a petri dish for deception, and without a fierce defense of greater voting rights protection, the infection of disinformation will continue to fester. Voting is not a privilege, but a fundamental right. Our citizens deserve more. In conclusion, my testimony includes 3 policy recommendations for Congress and the administration. First, increase funding for election administration. States like Florida that prohibit third-party donations to election officials are starving for funding to keep our democracy running. Second, increase DOJ resources to expand enforcement capacity of the voting section, ensuring that all eligible voters can cast a vote, have their vote counted, and have access to accurate information. And third, support nonpartisan federal voting legislation that protects all citizens. To realize the promise of democracy for all, we need to establish robust standards and restore the 1965 Voting Rights Act to its full strength. It is imperative that the federal government act now to protect the dilution, discrimination, and disenfranchisement of voters in Florida. We look forward to working with you. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you as well. Our final witness appears to be Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson, you are now recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And good morning, Chairman Butterfield, Ranking Member Style, Ranking Member Davis, and the committee. Thank you for allowing me to testify here today. It's fair to say that most of us remember and recall the general election of 2000. In the 20 years since, Florida and many other states have made great strides, culminating in an extremely accurate and administratively successful 2020 general election. Florida made these improvements to allow voters more accessibility in voting options. We have a no excuse vote by mail option. We have early voting options with flexibilities for supervisors. We also have election day voting as well. And election security has been a top priority that myself, my 66 other colleagues, and the Department of State have gone into great partnerships to make sure that elections in the state of Florida remain secure. One of the things that I would like to say personally about myself, upon being elected in 2020, I became the first African-American to hold a constitutional seat in the history of Seminole County. I'm a proud Black American that believes in the American dream. I looked at my wife the other day, and we both agreed that we were living it. Coming from broken homes, I saw so much failure, her and I both, that my father would say to me, Chris, I am the perfect example of what not to be. And I only hope that as I sit in front of each and every one of you today, in this humble and honored participation on this committee, that I am the perfect example of what he wanted me to be. My grandmother, Ida, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned that you have family in Ocala. Well, my family's from Dunellen, Florida, just 23 miles away from Ocala. And, you know, she picked fruit to put food on her table. She, to clothe her children. My father was raised in a shack in those backwoods. And who knew that a little boy from Dunellen, Florida, would one day sit in front of members of Congress and talk about democracy as he wrote sermons and one day hoped to speak to the masses. So I'm extremely grateful. I want to take a moment to give you some statistics about Seminole County in particular, as I represent there. We have 335,035 voters. The Times Magazine said that Seminole County is a picture of the United States, that the way that the general election will go in 2020, that will tell the tale for the rest of the country. We had 262,092 votes, ballots cast in that election. That was almost an 80% turnout. Our population is 466,000. So we have roughly 70% of our population registered, and they do vote. I believe that voters will make voting a priority. We have our voting population is essentially a third and a third and a third. We have approximately 35,521 registered African Americans. We have approximately 54,709 Hispanic Americans. We've seen a great turnout from all spectrums of our voting population. And I'd just like to say that, you know, my first election in 2020, who knew it would be a worldwide pandemic on top of it? And without the partnership from Governor Ron DeSantis, without the Secretary of State's office, listening to election officials, I believe that is what made the 2020 election safe, it made it secure, and it made it successful. And we've had a great turnout ever since. I'm looking forward to 2022. 2022 is definitely going to be one of the most important midterm elections in our country's history. And that's what election officials are doing. I've heard the mention of redistricting. Let me explain that supervisor of elections are in charge of your re-precincting. It is our job to make sure that every voter, regardless of what they look like, regardless of what's in their bank account, have the ability and the access to the ballot. And that's what my job is, and that's what I will make sure happens. So I want everyone here to know that there is a supervisor, and I can speak for my other 66 colleagues in saying we will do everything in our power to make sure that every voter in the state of Florida has the opportunity to vote. Thank you very much.
And we thank you as well, Mr. Anderson, for your testimony. It is now time for member questions, and we will take it in this order. First, it will be Aguilar, Style, Ledger, Fernandez, Kamek, Lawson, Jimenez, and the chair. This time, the chair recognizes Mr. Aguilar of California.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks to all our panelists for joining us today on such an important topic. I appreciate Mr. Anderson talking about that this election was secure and safe. I think Americans and Floridians need to know that from the highest levels of government over the past year and a half. We've heard time and time again that wasn't the case. From the former president. So I appreciate elections officials time and time again speaking before us, Mr. Chairman, and reemphasizing that important point. Mr. Ashwell, last month, Governor DeSantis signed Senate Bill 524, which we've talked about here a little today. And I was concerned and troubled by one specific provision within the bill that created the nation's only election police unit that's supposedly to investigate election complaints. Can you tell me what system is in place right now in Florida to receive elections-related complaints and allegations? Can you explain to us how the system works and why the governor proposes to create a new authority for this purpose?
Sure. Excuse me. Thank you. So the current system is a little fragmented, to be honest. I mean, complaints about election problems can go to the local supervisor. They can come in through the Secretary of State's hotline. It can come in through the local sheriff. And I think it's true that there could be better coordination of it. Our contention and position against this office, this new office, all along was that it was expensive and unnecessary, that the funds being used to create this new office, which has a myriad of problems, could have been more effectively used to just create better coordination and training among existing law enforcement agencies. Go ahead.
Does it concern you that individuals that this new law enforcement group will be around in the communities and could even muddy the process between some of those elections officials, county sheriffs, and some of those current reporting authorities?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's been very muddy throughout the entire legislative process. In every committee this bill was heard, a lot of the minority members pointed out that it would be duplicative, and the responses were basically that, hey, the more the merrier. If we have more agents looking at it, less fraud. And I mean, I think it's important to look at the whole underlying premise of this office. I mean, it's that there's this large problem of systemic fraud that isn't being captured by the current system. So their whole goal really with this, I believe, their whole goal with this office is to substantiate claims that there is this problem, to build a record of there being a problem that really isn't there. And we've tried to press them, others have tried to press them to requires more substantive reporting on the back end. This office will have to report to the legislature annually on the number of complaints they receive, the nature of those complaints, but doesn't have to report on frivolous complaints. We would contend that a lot of what they're probably going to get are frivolous complaints from people who have bought into conspiracy theories and election lies. And
I think that's fair given the track record that we've seen. I'm sorry, because of time I've got to interrupt you, try to get a question into Ms. Bennett.
Thank you.
Ms. Bennett, in November of 2018, Floridians overwhelmingly voted to restore voting rights to citizens who had prior felony convictions. You talked about this in your testimony, but the legislature changed the confines of that law. to ensure that that it wasn't implemented. Can you explain how Senate Bill 7066 is a poll tax against poor Black and brown Floridians?
Yes, thank you for the question. So when Senate Bill 7066 was passed, it was passed as sort of an implementing legislation, even though Amendment 4 by many organizations was clear and self-executing. Senate Bill 76 made it a requirement that returning citizens or formerly incarcerated people repay fines, fees, and restitution prior to them regaining their right to vote. When an incarcerated individual is released from prison, that person is given $50 and a bus pass. The first thing on their mind is, can I find me a place to stay, a place to eat, a bed, or possibly even a job that will even hire a formerly incarcerated felon. And then they didn't have to navigate Florida's decentralized system of records. Florida's 67 clerk of courts, the Department of State, the Department of Corrections, the Office of Executive Clemency, all of these different agencies keep different records. And it was noted in the district court's opinion on Senate Bill 7066 that even the Secretary of State acknowledged it was unclear how a former felon could actually verify how much they owed. And so couple that with an inability of someone to pay these fines, fees, and restitutions, even if they could determine what they owed, it definitely amounts to a poll tax.
The gentleman's time.
Thank you, Ms. Bennett. Yep, my time's expired. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Yield back.
Good to see you, sir. Good to see you. Now we'll go from California to Wisconsin. Mr. Stile, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Anderson, I'd like to go straight to you on what I think might be the most important topic here of the day, which is despite the claims that the Georgia election law changes would devastate turnout. In fact, according to all results last night for the 2022 primaries, the turnout was higher than it was in the 2020 primaries. And so the question I have for you is, why do you think there's such a disconnect between the rhetoric we continue to hear on the left and the actual results that we saw in Georgia in the voter participation at high rates that we continue to see in Florida as well?
Because there is not and thank you very much for the question. And because there's not enough emphasis put on the amount of outreach that is done by election officials. We do a ton of outreach in our community to make sure that folks are registering to vote, that they are prepared on election day. I myself have just signed a contract for marketing dollars to start advertising on streaming services, to start taking advantage of social media in many different ways. I had my community services coordinator who controls our social media say to me that, guess what, Supervisor, we now have our social media platforms verified. You need to meet voters where they are and communicate with them.
Understood, and I appreciate that comment. Do you think it's more challenging due to the rhetoric on the left that they continue to beat the drum and tell people that it's difficult to vote? Do you find yourself having to expend funds from the state of Florida to get the word out that it's actually easy to vote and hard to cheat because we have dishonest rhetoric? We have misstatements, including from the President of the United States, really mischaracterizing voter integrity laws. Do you find yourself having to expend funds to get our message out that it's easy to vote and hard to cheat?
I will say that what I find is that the misinformation, it's hard to pierce through the noise. I've said this to my staff, and I've said it over and over again, that we have to do a better job from an association. I'm the chairman of the Public Relations Committee for the Supervisor Elections Association in the state of Florida. And we are going to do our job to get that information to the voters.
Well, I appreciate the work you're doing. I think we need to do a better job in Congress for people to understand how the president earned 4 Pinocchios for his comments in Georgia, and the proof is in the pudding with massive and record voter turnout yesterday in Georgia. We continue to see high voter participation rates in Florida, higher than we would see in the president's home state of Delaware. And as the ranking member of the full committee noted, we continue to see far more restrictive voting laws in states like New York, Delaware, than we do in Republican-led states. I want to dive in particularly on voter ID, an area that I think is a really reasonable voter protection, one that H.R. 1 wants to completely gut nationwide. Could you comment as to what forms of voter ID are acceptable in Florida?
So we have 12 acceptable forms of ID per Florida State Statute 101.043. You can use a concealed weapons permit, your Florida driver's license, your Florida ID, an out-of-state student ID card, there a residence card if you live at an ALF. There are so many different forms of identification that you can use to come in and vote. And in my policy in Seminole County, and I know in many other counties in the state of Florida, we never turn a voter away. There is a provisional process in place.
Let me get this straight. You've never turned a voter away who did not have an ID?
Never. We will never turn a voter away.
I think that's important for the record. Then that is important. And the key here is we're making it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. I just want to briefly turn, if I can, to Ms. Bennett on the panel. Over the past several years, we've had increased focus on election security. I think that's important. And cybersecurity and infrastructure security is an important piece of that. Can I ask you if you support enhancing cybersecurity in resiliency of our elections, yes or no?
I believe that individuals should have free and fair access to the ballot.
No, just understood. But do you support enhancing cybersecurity and resiliency in our elections?
If it makes it more difficult, it erects barriers for individuals, no.
So you're unsure if we should be investing in cybersecurity and resilience. So let me just say, I think it's important that we do that and that we have broad protections to make sure that we have robust security in our elections, that we make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Recognizing, Mr. Chairman, that I'm out of time. Appreciate you holding today's hearing on this important topic, and I will yield back.
And thank you as well, Mr. Stowell. We will now go from Wisconsin to New Mexico, where we had our last hearing just a few weeks ago. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Butterfield, and for coming to.
Thank you and your husband for taking me out to dinner when I got to your county. Mr. Lawson didn't show up last night. He had a Boy Scout commitment, but he did take me to breakfast this morning. Thank you.
But did they have any green chili like we have in New Mexico? You know, the hearing in New Mexico is great because it showed all the work that we have done here to make sure that we make it easier for everybody to vote, and that has never sacrificed the integrity, because we've seen that there aren't issues with integrity in our elections. And I want to just remind everybody that our Constitution, our United States Constitution, provides in Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, that Congress has the right to pass election laws for federal elections. Indeed, the writers of the Constitution believed that it was essential that Congress have this power, since there was a fear that states would seek to undermine the elections for Congress, the federal elections. So the writers of our Constitution were concerned about what states might do to impact everybody's ability to vote, and in some ways were looking into the future, those writers of our Constitution, and describing what we are seeing in Republican-controlled states. So I would say that honoring our Constitution, for those who believe in this Constitution, which we hold dear, honoring our Constitution means that you believe in Congress's role to protect voting for every citizen, regardless of color of skin or size of bank account. But sadly, we now see those who oppose allowing all voters easy access to the ballot. So having, they're empowering anti-voting vigilantes. They're empowering anti-democratic vigilantes against poll workers and voters. So this Republican tendency to threaten to criminalize a citizen's choice to vote, a citizen's choice, right, to control their own future, which you do by voting, is in stark evidence in Florida and in other states that we've heard about over the this time. And what I've heard each of the witnesses talk about is the voter turnout in 2020, right? High voter turnout. And I haven't heard anybody say that there was anything but that the election was safe and secure. So let me ask the witnesses that. Is there anybody on our panel here that disagrees that the election was safe and secure in 2020 in Florida?
It was safe and secure.
Yes, it was. The election was.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I didn't hear anybody say that it wasn't safe and secure. So as Mr. Chair, as you noted, even the governor, DeSantis, noted that the 2020 election was safe and secure. And I would ask unanimous consent to enter into an article in the record that notes Mr. DeSantis' remarks that the 2020 election inspired confidence, and that's a November 4th, 2010 Tampa Bay News article titled, "Why Can't These States Be More Like Florida?" So it leads me to the question of why, if Florida, including the governor, believed that election integrity was not an issue, why they use that as a rationale for laws that make it more difficult to vote, when we all just agreed that it was safe and secure. Mr. Ashwell, as you know, SB 90 restricts access to mail-in ballots as it imposes stringent ID requirements and reduces the amount of time that a voter can remain on the state's vote by mail list. Is there any, could you describe what the actual impact of limiting access to mail-in ballots is? And could you focus a little bit on Latinos' access to mail-in ballots?
Sorry, what was the last part of your question? I didn't. Do you know, Dima?
What's the actual impact of limiting access to mail-in ballots, particularly for Latinos?
Oh, Latinos. Thank you for the question. Black and Latino voters used vote by mail last election cycle in I'd say record rates. Vote by mail has been very popular in Florida, very successful. We've had it for a very long time. There haven't been problems. But Black and Latino voters used it at twice the rate last election that they had in previous cycles. And it doesn't seem like a coincidence that we saw this wave of efforts to restrict the vote by mail process immediately follow that. Our concern is that these new restrictive laws, in conjunction with the waves of misinformation that are coming, particularly misinformation targeting Latino voters, are going to discourage those voters or discourage them at the very least from using vote by mail, which in the face of a pandemic, it was a very hard lift to convince a lot of folks who haven't traditionally used vote by mail that it was a safe and legitimate way to vote. So it was successful. Even the governor acknowledged that before he did his about face and said that we needed to pursue a slew of election integrity laws. But we're particularly concerned about some of the, it's hard to look at any of these provisions in isolation. One of the provisions that seems directly targeting to target Latino voters is a list maintenance provision that will require the DHS&V to provide non-citizen data to the state monthly. This is historically flawed data, and it's not really set up to accurately capture newly naturalized citizens.
Thank you, sir. The gentlelady's time has expired, regrettably. At this time, the chair.
Thank you. I yield back.
The chair is pleased to recognize the gentlelady from the 3rd District of Florida. Ms. Kamick, it is your turn. 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much for all of our witnesses for appearing here today. This is such an important topic, and I got to say, you guys came to the right place. If you want to know how to do elections right, the Sunshine State has a great example, and I mean that both literally and figuratively. I'm going to direct my first question to Supervisor Anderson. I want to thank you for being here today and representing the great work that Florida has done with our election laws. Now, we knew back in 2000, excuse me, that Florida needed to make some important changes to its election laws. No one can forget the infamous hanging chads. Now, can you highlight for us the major changes that were made and demonstrate now why Florida is the gold standard for elections, just summarizing the key changes and why these are so important for every state to implement?
Absolutely. And I will say that in order to remain at the tip of the spear in elections, in security and in administration, we have to take a proactive response, and I believe that's what the state of Florida is doing. The things that we've done to improve in 2020 are since 2000, adding a no excuse vote by mail option. That means that you can request a ballot be sent to you. You request that ballot be sent to another location as long as you send in written authorization with your original signature. So you can go on vacation and say, hey, Chris, I'll be here. Can you send my ballot here? We did that many, many different times in 2020. Early voting, you have a maximum of 14 days, 12 hours a day. You know, I broke that down in hours. I like to give people a good understanding of how it really, really works. So you have, during the general election, 168 hours of early voting. You can vote by mail 792 hours. You have 12 hours of voting on election day. You have a total of 970 hours to cast a ballot in the general election. That's quite a long time. And I believe that voters in Florida make sure that voting is a priority and they come out and vote. And we've seen that with the amount of turnout that we've had.
That's awesome. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. And I can assume, based on your testimony and your previous answers to questions, that you believe that a picture ID of some sort is required to vote, yes or no?
Yes.
Same question to you, Commissioner Holt, yes or no? Do you believe that a photo ID should be required to vote?
Yes, I think it should be a Social Security card with a picture on it.
Thank you. Mr. Ashwell, yes or no? Do you believe that a photo ID should be required to vote?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Schoon, I hope I'm saying that right.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, you do believe a photo ID is required to vote?
Yes, I do.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Bennett, do you believe that a photo ID should be required to vote?
Yes, some form of identification.
A photo ID?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Ms. Bennett, I'm going to stay with you to paraphrase in your testimony. You state that federal action is needed to prevent Florida from suppressing the vote. Is that correct?
Yes.
So stick with me on this hypothetical. If President Trump were still in office, would you want the Trump DOJ tasked with enforcing election law?
Yes.
Thank you. And Ms. Schoon, what election integrity safeguards does the League of Women Voters in Florida support?
Well, we've been supportive, and we're some of the proponents to support the ERIC, which is a way of the states talking to each other and checking to make sure that people are not double voting. We've testified about support of ERIC, and we were glad when the state supported it, and then we asked for funding for it. So that's one of the things that we've done.
Thank you. I too support the ERIC system. I think it is a common sense measure to safeguard our elections and make them more secure. You know, I could go through a litany of questions that I have listed out here today, but I'm short on time, so I'll say this. I think Florida has gotten it right from many years of doing it wrong. And this should not be a Republican versus Democrat issue. This is an American issue. So I would hope that instead of chasing political agendas, we can chase truth and we can chase after a way and continue to bolster election security so that everyone goes to the ballot box knowing that their vote is being counted as cast and intended. So I'm appreciative of the committee for being in the Sunshine State today, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing. I yield.
And we thank you as well for joining us. At this time, I'll recognize my friend, Mr. Lawson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to participate in this discussion. And I think my first question will go to Mr. Ashwell because he alluded to it. Out of nearly 11 million participants in Florida 2020 election, the Florida Department of State receives 262 complaints of election fraud and found reason to refer only 75 cases to law enforcement, which is less than 1/1,000%. In Florida, Senate Bill 524 recently passed, which created a new Office of Election, Crime, and Security. This office is responsible for conducting inquiries into alleged election crimes and allowing Florida governor to appoint his own special officers in every region of offices in the State Department of Law Enforcement. Can you speak on how election police units could give partisan and state politician control over how elections are conducted and scrutinized? And do you think this approach of election security will open the door for voting intimidation, harassment, a nonpartisan election administration trying to do their job?
Well, thank you for the question. There's a lot to say there. As far as giving partisan officials more of a role in tracking election problems or addressing election problems or violations of law, this office sits directly under the Secretary of State. She's overseeing, or he's overseeing it now. And our Secretary of State, it really gets at a fundamental issue with the structure of our Secretary of State's office. We had an elected Secretary of State up till 2000. I think a lot of us remember what happened in 2000 in Florida with Katherine Harris. We went to an appointed Secretary of State. So that Secretary of State is appointed by the governor and serves at that governor's pleasure. It's very much an instrument of the governor. And this law enforcement office is directly under it. I think it's also important to point out that in Florida this past session, this wasn't the only significant law enforcement entity created. Our legislature gave our governor twice the funding he asked for to reinstitute or reactivate a state guard. So a lot of us have questions about how this new office can work in conjunction with this new state guard that the governor has access to. And, I think after last election, a lot of us are on guard at how this entity could be used to challenge results, how it could be used to challenge the it could be used to build evidence, to challenge the certification results at the local or state level, maybe create the momentum to overturn them. And it's clear that that's no longer a far-out possibility. That's very much on the table and something we're concerned that can happen if there's a contentious race, say the U.S. Senate race. It's very competitive this cycle. If it didn't go the right way for the governor and his party, we could see him using every instrument at his disposal, as we saw the president do this past cycle at the federal level. So we're very concerned about just how this office can be used to perpetuate the myth that we have insecure elections, how it can be used to just undermine specific results in counties or at the state level. And I think the fact that this is being looked at as a model for other states is very disturbing. This is not a model. We really hope other states do not follow Florida's lead on this.
Okay, reclaiming my time, I'm going to ask Ms. Holt, could she speak to that?
Yes, in 2000, I was chair of the local Democratic Party, and we're the only county in the state of Florida that filed a complaint with the Secretary of State's office, Katherine Harris, and spoke to Mr. Clayton about irregularities in our voting office election over in Gaston County because people were not allowed to vote. We noticed that there were complaints about the voting machines and those type of things. So we filed a complaint with the Secretary's office. They sent a gentleman over that came over to monitor the election, and he did not contest anything that happened during that election, including the supervisor of elections sending people away. So that office has some irregularities in itself. So I would think that we would want that office elected by the people, the Secretary's office, and have something in there. The term elections police is intimidating in itself because the citizens don't know if there are going to be officers at the polling place. There are several things they do not know about this process. To do that during an election year is intimidating also. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. My time is running.
Gentleman yields back, and thank you very much, Mr. Lawson. We now will go to Miami-Dade, Florida, to the 26th Congressional District. The very distinguished gentleman from Miami-Dade, who I'm assuming is a supporter of the Miami Heat. They're in a 2-2 tie right now, and they head to Boston on Friday. So we will see. But take it away, Carlos.
Yes, I am. I'm a supporter of the Miami Heat. I think we play here tonight. So go Heat. In any event, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to participate. The reason I'm on is that I used to be the mayor of Miami-Dade County during the 2020 election. And as the mayor, I was also the supervisor of elections. So I know exactly how and what kind of elections we conducted here in Miami-Dade. And I can tell you that we had record numbers of people voting. We issued a note, a postcard to every single household that had a voter in it in Miami-Dade, reminding them they could request an absentee ballot. We've got record numbers of absentee ballots that were requested, and we had a record number of absentee ballots that were cast during the presidential election of 2020. In Miami-Dade, this is not the Miami-Dade of 2000. The Miami-Dade of 2022, the elections department is completely different. We learned from our past, and I can honestly say we are the model, okay, for not only the state of Florida, but probably for the rest of the nation. We pride ourselves in open and fair elections here in Miami-Dade with record number of participants, and we're a very diverse community. We're a majority-minority community here in Miami-Dade County. And the way we conducted our elections, we have drop boxes for the first time in history, and I know there's been a lot of talk about drop boxes and access to drop boxes here in Miami-Dade. The drop boxes were in our early voting sites. They were all monitored so that they were all always an employee of the elections department was always overseeing the drop boxes and what was being put in it, which secured that drop box. But I also have to remind everybody that as far as absentee ballots are concerned, there are drop boxes that are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're called United States Postal Service mailboxes. All right, that's where absentee ballots are supposed to be dropped off. Only when you don't have confidence in the United States Postal Service is when you go to a drop box and drop it off yourself. Also, there are these people, these individuals that come by your house or they come by your apartment or your ALF. They're called United States Postal Workers. They'll pick up your absentee ballot and take it to the elections department. One great thing that we do here also in Florida is that we count our absentee ballots as they come in. We don't divulge the number, but what that does, it allows us to have a count very early on as to what's happening. The only ones that we don't count or that we count as they come in are the ones that actually come in on election day. We don't accept any absentee ballots after 7 o'clock that reach our election department after 7 o'clock. They are not valid. The individuals had over a month to get these ballots in, so I'm sorry if you think that that's limiting access, but actually that's a pretty good amount of time to get your ballot in. And so what that does, it allows Miami-Dade County and the state of Florida to actually count the ballots probably much quicker than anybody else. And we don't have this issue of having to wait weeks to figure out who won the election. And so the rest of the country would actually follow our lead. We could probably find out who the president of the United States is by early morning, maybe early morning the next day at the latest, instead of having to wait weeks and weeks and weeks to figure out all these ballots that may be coming in from all over the place, which I think it's really that's wrought. Could be wrought with fraud, all right, and so that's why we do things this way in Miami-Dade County and in the state of Florida. Frankly, I believe we're the gold standard, and if the rest of the nation followed our lead, the great state of Florida, I think that the issue of election integrity would be put to bed. We do have a very secure election system here in the state of Florida, and with very, very few complaints. You didn't hear people saying, gee, I really couldn't get to a polling place. Gee, I really couldn't drop off my absentee ballot. Gee, I couldn't, give it to my post office worker. It just didn't happen because, frankly, much of the rhetoric about access and somehow we're restricting voting is just that. It's rhetoric. And actually, it runs counter to what this committee wants to do, which is to create confidence in our election system. And I can tell you with 100% accuracy, there is confidence in Florida state's election system. And with that, I yield back. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. And thank you for your testimony, and thank you for your questions. All right, I guess it is my turn. I think in the opening statement, I recall Mr. Stowell, and let's get the clock started. Mr. Stowell made reference to the election yesterday in Georgia. He mentioned that it was an incredibly large turnout, and it was. Aside from watching what was happening down in Texas last night, I did switch over and look at the news coming out of Georgia, and it was an incredible turnout. And I heard Mayor Jimenez a minute ago talk about the record number of people who vote in Florida. And as a former lawyer, and well, I'm still a lawyer, but as a former judge and lawyer, let me use a legal term, I stipulate that we are beginning to see very, very large turnouts, and it's attributable to many, many different factors. But just because you have high turnout doesn't mean that bad laws aren't barriers to voting. I want to put that into the record. Overcoming barriers and casting a ballot does not mean that these barriers don't exist, and it doesn't make them fair. And so, yes, we need to have large turnouts, but we also need to remove any potential that may get in the way of people voting. I am also very interested in the testimony that I've heard today about the elections police. That has just piqued my curiosity. It's different, it's novel, and probably unnecessary in Florida, given the statistics that I've heard coming out of this state. There's not widespread fraud, voter fraud in Florida. There's none in my state. I guess there are sprinklings of fraud in every state in the union. But local police, the state bureaus of investigation and local law enforcement are very capable of handling those, and why the state of Florida needs to create an elections police. It seems to be politicizing this more than it needs to be. And so I guess I want to start with Ms. Bennett. You mentioned it in your testimony. What do these people do, these 20-some elections? What do they do? First of all, let me clear one thing. Do they show up at the polling places? I hope not. Let's clear that up.
So as Brad mentioned in his testimony, so the law enforcement, currently now, law enforcement receives complaints or certain things that come to them, and then they investigate them. The issue we have with the elections, the Office of Election Crimes, is that it's not necessarily clear how and what they will investigate, quote unquote, election irregularities. And throughout the legislative session, different members tried to really bring out what this would encompass.
Will they wear uniforms?
It's not clear exactly.
You don't know. Will they be paid taxpayer money?
They are paid. The combined office as well as the police force, the additional law enforcement costs is estimated $3.7 million for these two efforts combined.
Seems to be very, very unnecessary. Let me go to you, Ms. Schoon. You note in your testimony that the redistricting process has historically been manipulated, often to the detriment of marginalized communities and especially African-American voters. When minority voting power is diluted, and diluted on purpose, what is the long-term impact on minority communities?
Well, it reinforces that voting and minority communities don't go together because of the history of intentional discrimination and violence against Black voters that has been taught and passed down in our families. When you have election police, when you have redistricting that limits the voice of African